Welcome to the Servant Leaders Mindset Podcast, where we are changing lives through servant leaders.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the show. Today's show will focus on healing ministry. To have this discussion, I've invited my very special guest, the Reverend Dr. David Chotka.
You said it
David?
right. Well done.
Thank you. David Chotka is the founder and director of Spirit Equipped Ministries, a cross denominational equipping ministry focused on developing spiritual disciplines. He's also the chair of the Alliance Pray Team, a ministry developed by the General Assembly of the Christian Missionary Alliance of Canada. The team serves as a catalyst to develop prayer equipping resources and events in the healing prayer movement and beyond. He recently published an amazing book, which we're going to talk about, with Dr. Matt C. Dunham, titled Healing Prayer. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
So, before we start talking about the book, I'd like to start with talking about how the healing ministry has impacted your life personally. Could you please share with the audience your personal testimony of your wife's miraculous healing?
Oh, okay. There's many stories here, but yes, that one forever changed my life. Yes. So I fell in love with this girl, and her mother had FSH muscular dystrophy. Her sister has FSH muscular dystrophy. A niece has it. She has it. And FSH is facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy. It means you don't die young, but you lose muscle mass, and you wind up having the back muscles and your abdominal muscles disintegrate. You have difficulty being able to rise, and if you damage a muscle, you lose it forever. And it's a plateau decline disease. And so you'll be fine for 2 or 3 years at a particular plateau, and then suddenly there'll be catastrophic loss, and then you'll plateau again. And so by the time when you're in your teens, you start to feel pain in your shoulder blades. They go out of position. Your face sags, but you're still able to function. Then you come into your 30s, and you start to lose a lot more, and then you plateau for a while. And eventually you wind up in a wheelchair. So my mother-in-law lived to 85. She lived that ripe old age, but she died using a wheelchair and adaptations, things for all of her life. And from the time she was in her 50s and 60s right through till the time she died, she was adapting to everything. And the genes reduplicate, and so it gets worse with generation after generation. So my wife's sister and her were, set to have less capacity than her mother. At any rate, here's what happened. The girl loved me. Hey, she laughed at my bad jokes. So anyway, when the decision came to marry, I knew that I would be pushing a wheelchair at the end of my life. I knew it. And that was the hard part in making the decision to marry. But in fact, she was the first girl to accept me just as I am. So I said, let's do this. And we got married. And, in the first couple of years, it didn't seem to matter much. With the birth of our son, she lost a lot of muscle mass. She lost a lot of tissue. And so we decided not to get pregnant again. And we adopted our daughter. But moving on to the rest of the story, what happened was, she was in a particularly bad state. We moved to a church in Alberta. It was a fairly large congregation. When we arrived, it had 700. When we left, it had about 1,100 people in it. Multiple services on a weekend.
Wow.
And so it was a lot of work. And the difference between small church and big church, you work just as hard, but you work differently. you have to find staff to carry your things. But regardless of this, excellence becomes the order of the day. And there was lots and lots and lots of intellectual work as well as people work and so on. But she was in this place where she was starting to decline. We had purchased a house with stairs to go up to the bathroom and to her bedrooms. And if she was going to go up the stairs, she had to literally grab her leg and lift it a little bit to position it on the step. Move the other leg to do the same, grab a hold of the banisters on both sides and gradually pull herself up. And it would take 25, 30 minutes for her to do 6 or 7 steps. She could not raise her arms higher than her shoulders at that point in the game. And it was getting increasingly difficult for me to travel. I was doing itinerant work as well as local church pastoring with the Alliance Pray Team, traveling to Alliance fields across the earth. And I'd spoken in 17 different countries. And the bottom line was, I was going to have to think about not doing that. We were going to buy ourselves a house with one floor. But one of the things that we did do was to partner with 2 American congregations to help North Uganda rebuild. That area had been ravaged by Joseph Kony, that awful, this guy called himself the Lord's Resistance Army. But the Lord had nothing to do with that evil man. He was cutting people's arms and legs off and taking out their tongues and raping things. And I don't want to describe the horrors that that man did, but he ravaged the north of Uganda. Together with Idi Amin, those 2 of them, it was a really sad thing in North Uganda. If somebody could read, they could be the school teacher. I mean, there was no education, there was no health care, there was nothing. And as it turned out, there was a revival that was beginning to take place. And there were church leaders who had survived the onslaught, who were trying their best to rebuild in North Uganda. And my congregation partnered with 2 American ones to go over there. So there was an organizing bishop. And he was a charismatic kind of a guy. He was always doing amazing things. And he had managed to organize between 750 and 1,200 pastors to come for educational purposes. And then he'd do a big crusade, and we do this together. So anyway, I participated in that. And my congregation spent a lot of money to help them get started, et cetera. And they wanted to meet this guy. So we flew him into Canada to do an event. And at this point in the game, my wife's health was rapidly diminishing. She was utterly unable to go up those steps. I already described it to you. And we were very seriously thinking about getting a 1-floor home and seeing what we could do to accommodate around that. And so, and we're praying all the time. I'll just tell you something. Here is the strange irony, Lena. She would pray for people and they get healed. We would pray for her and she wasn't healed.
Wow.
And we didn't make any sense of this. In fact, there's one story in the book where she prays for a girl named Tammy, and I have Tammy's written testimony. Tammy had had her eye damaged when she was pulling down a decoration from a wall. She had her cornea and her pupil scratched, and it was punctured, and it was terrible. My wife and I prayed for that girl together with 14 others. We watched her eyeball grow back. And she got, this happened when my wife was declining from muscular dystrophy. So we were in this kind of strange, already not yet kind of life. So here's what happened. There's a bishop who comes and he's speaking in the church, and he's telling dramatic war stories. I mean, he's talking about how 300,000 intercessors were praying against Joseph Kony's army for the Ugandan army. And he's telling deliverance from death stories with people praying and somebody's bullet missing somebody else's body and that kind of thing. Of course, everybody in the church is sitting on the edge of their seats. It's a packed congregation. It was the last service of the 3 we did on a weekend. And people from the first to the second service came to the third one. So it was overpacked, and it was standing room only. The sanctuary sat about 400 to 450 people. And we had 650 people in that sanctuary lined up against the walls. I was actually sitting on the steps of the platform next to the guy who was preaching, looking out over the congregation because there was no seat for me. At any rate, my wife sat 2 rows from the front. And this man had a thick Ugandan accent, and we had to be careful to listen to him. And he was telling one of these dramatic stories, and he stopped. And he looked down at me, and he said, in his accent, I don't want to make fun of the accent, I'm just trying to capture the sense. He said, David, what is M.A.? And I thought, M.A.? Master of Arts? I don't know. And then he did this. He said, no, it's a wasting muscle disease. No, sorry. So he put his head in the pulpit. He waited, and then he looked up and he said, "It's a wasting muscle disease, and whoever has this, it starts in your head and it goes down into your shoulders. Your face sags. You lose muscle control. Your shoulder blades get out of position. You come into chronic pain between 16 and 20. You have scoliosis in your spine. You damage a muscle and you lose it." And he went on and gave a medically accurate, perfect description of FSH muscular dystrophy.
Wow.
And in fact, as he was doing this, of course, the small hairs are rising on the back of my head. In fact, the small hairs vanish from the top of my head. If anybody's watching, I'm bald as a cuke. Anyway, I was in awe as he was saying this. And now, of course, I'm looking at my wife because I'm realizing he's describing my wife's medical condition. And then he said this as I was looking at my wife from that seat at the front of the church with this packed congregation. He said, "Whoever has this condition, Jesus has just healed you." And her arms went above her head for the first time in more than 20, 25 years. She'd not been able to do that. All pain from her body vanished. And we had guests who had come to hear this guest preacher come from Vancouver to our church just outside of Edmonton. And so the plan was to take care of them. And I was to go home and get the heavy pots off the top shelves so that she could cook in the kitchen to prepare for everybody who was staying with us. She pushed me out of the way. She climbed up and she took down the pots and pans herself and cooked the
Mm.
meal right there. And about a week later, this is funny. A week later, my daughter, who is a very sweet, kind little girl, we adopt her, was making fun of her brother, and her brother was doing everything in his power to be Christian, but she was pushing every single button that she could think of, and she never does this. Finally, I was about to discipline my daughter when my wife lost it, and she stomped her foot and she said, "Jessica Chotka, that's enough." And she grabbed her by the hand and she ran her up the stairs and made her pick up her toys and made her make her bed and made her brush her teeth and ran her down the stairs, got her in the van and took her to school. And we were so mad at her. We didn't realize for 3 hours that my wife had run up the stairs. She got down and
Wow.
helped pick up the toys and then raced our daughter down into the
Wow.
car. We were just so mad we didn't. And then we looked at each other and we said, "You ran up the stairs. You haven't run up the stairs since I've met you." I mean, we're talking decades where it was just the most incredible, amazing thing. And I have
Wow.
to tell you that the day after the healing occurred, ordinarily I'd have to go to my wife's side of the bed. She'd have to put her arms on my shoulders. I'd have to lift her to get her to the shower so she could limber up enough to be able to move the lower part of her body.
Mm.
She jumped out of bed and went to the shower by herself. It was the most incredible, amazing thing. Now, I should
Wow.
tell you about the difference between the way Western people and African tribal people see miracle. So
Mm.
this part's not in the book, but I think
Sure, sure.
it's really important. So
Mhm.
when that happened, of course, all kinds of people in the church knew us. Had been there almost 5 years at that point, and so we were not strangers to the congregation, and many people were our friends. Some ladies from the church had come and helped my wife clean because she couldn't move furniture, heavy objects. And so it was really humbling for my wife to have to do that, but they would come and
Mm.
help, and they knew. And they were sitting all around us when this happened. Everybody in the church, absolutely everybody, walked up and said, "We are so astonished, amazed, and we're so happy for you. God has granted you this mercy." And that was the way that everybody in the church talked. There had to be 300 of those conversations, easily 300 of those. So
Mhm.
my wife and I went to Uganda together for the next trip. And she led a women's ministry thing, and I did the teaching for the pastors and so on because the bishop had now met her, and this is amazing. Anyway, we're in Africa, and we're in a church, and we're telling the story. And I don't know if you've ever been in an African church. When they worship, they dance. Oh my heavens!
Yeah, yeah, but I've heard.
They pick up their chairs and they start moving their chairs over their heads and they dance around the room. And they started doing that, and then they looked at us and they said, "God has visited your congregation. God has visited your city. A great wonder has happened so that the gospel can be proclaimed throughout your region." And they didn't want to know the details. They wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to tell the gospel to the town. And so
Wow.
that
Mm.
night, my wife and I were scratching our heads over this very thing. I mean, the Canadians and the Americans all said, "Congratulations, isn't this amazing?" And the Ugandans said, "God has raised up something in your people." So that night we were looking at Luke in our studies, our devotions. It was Luke 7. It was the story of Jesus raising the widow of Nain's son from the dead.
Mm.
And there's two crowds. There's the burial crowd coming out of this little town called Nain, and there's this big crowd following Jesus as he's doing signs and wonders and teaching and so on. And the two crowds meet. There's this dead boy in a coffin.
Mhm.
Jesus looks at the widow and says, "No, don't grieve." And he walks over, puts his hand on the side of the coffin. The boy sits up, and he's alive. And this incredible miracle happens. And the response of the crowd was like this. They did not say, "Congratulations, this is amazing." They said, "A great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people."
Mm. Mhm.
It was the exact response of the Ugandan tribals that I was with
Interesting.
in
Yeah.
comparison to So here's what I believe about gifts of healing. They're not given to the individual. They're given to the cluster of relationships around the individual.
Mhm.
And gifts of healing are not located in one person who prays for another. Gifts
Mm.
of healing are located in the power of the Holy Spirit, who lands on the person who's receiving the healing and lands on the people who are praying for the recipient. and together they share gifts of healing.
I love that. Yeah.
And and the bottom line is the Lord doesn't want any one person to get the glory for this. He
Right.
wants many people to get he wants God to get the